Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the path between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, and welcome to this bonus episode of Mythic Mind. I mentioned last time that there's a lot of things going on here between the book club, the Star Wars series, some other conversations that I'm having here and there, and so you're going to get some extra content here and there. And so this is a bonus episode, as I was able to recently speak with Spencer Askew. Spencer is, we kind of have a real life connection that we discovered through connecting on X. But Spencer, coming out of Tennessee, he's interested in Lewis and in storytelling and fantasy, fairy tale, and so he recently joined up with Mythic Mind, and we decided that we wanted to plan a conversation, and we decided that we would talk about Lewis, which is obviously a very broad topic of conversation, and so we started talking about Lewis from there, really following in this Abolition of Man idea of kind of dealing with the real versus the artificial. We moved from Lewis to Star Wars to Tolkien to postmodern storytelling, and we kept kind of intermingling these ideas. And so we cover a lot of ground. It seems a little bit meandering at times, but actually there's this common thread of dealing with the question of the reality, especially in storytelling, and how do we maintain our feet firmly grounded on the real while engaging with a world that has embraced the shadow. It's not an easy question, but that's something that we at least start to deal with in this conversation. I feel like it was a productive conversation. I hope that you enjoy it, and let's go ahead and get started here. Oh, wait, before we get started with that conversation, I do want to mention, because we didn't include this in the actual conversation we had together, that Spencer is over on X at Spencer_Askew, and he recently started his Substack at SpencerRyanAskew.substack.com, and I'll link to both of those in the show notes. So make sure that you follow him, make sure that you sub to his Substack, and just continue to check out what he has to offer. But now let's go ahead and get into this conversation. All right, Spencer, welcome to Mythic Mind. We didn't have a super clear agenda for this. I know we were talking about Lewis, and so I guess that's where we'll start. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of who you are, what you have going on, and then you can go ahead and get into a little bit with your background with Lewis.
Sure. I'm Spencer Askew. Excited to be here on the Mythic Mind, and I am an aspiring writer. Just recently released my Substack. I've been releasing some essays and also a couple short stories. Working on writing a fairy tale right now and a nonfiction book that kind of dives into a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today, that I think really ties into that hideous strength and thing, especially that book, which I'm sure we'll get into. And I live here in Columbia, Tennessee with my wife, and just really fell in love with Lewis 3 separate times in my life. And I'll kind of give a brief overview of why that happened each time, and we can jump right in onto, we could talk for hours on this stuff, I feel like. But, like most people, my first experience with Lewis was the Chronicles of Narnia when I was a kid. And I remember reading through them, and this is kind of a theme for Lewis with me, where the books I don't get the first time I read them end up becoming my favorites down the line. As a kid, I felt like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I very easily understood. I grew up in the church, so I saw the Christ allegory in that story very quickly. Didn't get the horse and his boy, didn't get the silver chair, but I still loved these books, and I read them several times in elementary school and probably the beginning of middle school as well. And then I got super into like Westerns and sci-fi. And I remember I found a copy of Ender's Game and Dune and Hyperion by Dan Simmons, and got super into sci-fi for a while, and came back to Lewis my senior year of high school. We had this thing called the Senior Project, and I was a public school in Mississippi, and they let you spend an entire school year researching something. And for me, I wanted to do the authenticity of Christianity. Like, that's what I wanted to do. I was really into apologetics. And so I got like the Lee Strobel books and the Josh McDowell books, and they kept coming back to this argument, the liar, lunatic, or Lord argument that C.S. Lewis outlines in Mere Christianity. And he also outlines it in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I had forgotten about until that point. And so I went and read Mere Christianity and got super into him again, read some of his nonfiction things, like the Screw Tape Letters and, the basics. And then my senior year of college, oh, and then I got really into fantasy. Like that's when I read like Lord of the Rings for the first time. That's when I started reading things like Wheel of Time and all these other big fantasy series. And so I came back to C.S. Lewis during a philosophy course my senior year of college. I wasn't a philosophy major. I was a music major and a business major. I did 2 years of, opera and composition, and then decided I wanted to get some business background because I wanted to move to Nashville and be a country music star. And my wife and I did end up moving here. We did end up doing the music industry for several years and got out of it. That's a whole nother story. It was fun for a time, but so I had one more elective and I took a philosophy class and we read The Abolition of Man. And it was at Liberty University, so it was highly focused on Lewis. Like they had us buy an entire collection, but we really focused on Abolition of Man. And it had, Mere Christianity, Great Divorce, Grief Observed, Problem of Pain, um, all those, and Abolition of Man. And it was after I read that book that I dove into everything else. It was the Space Trilogy. And for me, Out of the Silent Planet rocked my world. The really interesting view that I'd never heard positive before about death, and the unfallen world and sort of that medieval cosmology that Lewis is famous for. Paralandra after that became my favorite, and it's still, I think, a masterpiece. Probably the best fictionalized account or argument for both God's sovereignty and the will of his creation. Thought that was brilliant. And then you get into That Hideous Strength, and I didn't get it the first time. I was like, this is strange. What's Merlin doing here? Who are these nice guys? But when I came back around again for my second read through, that's when it hit me a whole new way, especially kind of with what was happening in our culture. This anti-humanism, transhumanism, Neuralink, AI, all that good stuff. You start to realize that in a lot of ways, C.S. Lewis was prophetic about these sort of things. He predicted what was going to happen if we allowed, science and progress without temperance, without having it guided by temperance and wisdom. And so, and it's been nonstop from there, man. Been nonstop from there.
Well, good. I appreciate that story. And honestly, I'm a little bit envious in that I wasn't a super active reader as a kid. I mean, I did read Narnia with my parents when I was, a young kid. Somewhere along the way as a teenager, I think I read the Screw Tape Letters.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I only really discovered Lewis as an adult, really just like a few years ago, when I was open up to fiction in general, starting with Tolkien. I just kind of devoured that. And then first Lewis I picked up based off, I asked Twitter, what do I read next? And the resounding answer was Till We Have Faces. So I read that, and from that point, I couldn't stop, and so I went
Yeah.
right the space series or Ransom series. I try not to say space, right? That's the wrong
Yeah.
name. So the Ransom series to Narnia again and elsewhere, and um, you said that Lewis is prophetic, and I think that's true. Anyone who's read Lewis attentively recognizes that. Why do you think he was able to have that kind of intuition about where things are headed? What do you think set him up for that?
I think, there are those authors that are out there. Another one that comes to mind is like a Dostoevsky, some of the great Russians, and I think guys like Wendell Berry, who's not as well known, but he's still alive. He's in his 90s, that have an insight into, maybe even it's just pattern recognition. But I think ultimately for Lewis, it was that pre-modern mind. A lot of people call him the last of the medievals. And kind of like Boethius was the last of the Romans. And Lewis was so heavily invested, much like Tolkien, in the medieval mind and that cosmology. And I think he understood what education was about. Because I think, I was thinking about this yesterday actually. Saw something on Twitter that that made me angry, of course. And I think that the pre-modern mind, the medieval mind in particular, viewed education as sort of this cultivation of virtue. The first aspect of education is the cultivation of virtue. And now it's just kind of, and I'm not saying for everyone, but I'm saying for some of these, especially STEM fields and things, it's much more about credentials to be able to do your one thing very well, and the cultivation of virtue is not as important. And so I think for him, or not even addressed at all, really. And so I think for him, it was that he viewed the world very, very differently. And it's a way that it's very alien to us unless we really, really work hard and read good old books and think deeply and try to kind of re-enchant our world. So what I mean by all this, to answer your question, I had to veer off for a second, but it was like, for him, literature wasn't just a subject he had to study, medieval literature in particular. It kind of provided like a timeless way of seeing the world that was lost with the advent of modernity. And so for him, he viewed the world as this kind of like glorious icon. He used the term iconic, right? And how if we, with the new ignorance, he called it the new ignorance that came with the scientific revolution, new learning and new ignorance. He wasn't, completely against all this learning, but he recognized that once you start to concretize everything, once you begin to focus all of your learning on the quantifiable, then you lose something. You lose something, and what you lose is that understanding of the universe as like a single complex harmonious structure of divine order. I mean, you can walk into an old cathedral and see that kind of meticulous order and the saturation of light from the stained glass windows and all these sorts of things, and that was all a way of lifting our eyes, and really elevating. And so when naturally we focus on the quantifiable, but then because we're humans and we long for that cohesive mental model, the scientific world begins to make judgments on the non-quantifiable, but it has no standing to handle ethics or theology or philosophy. And so I think for him, he was like, well, just much like Dostoevsky, he said, we're losing something that makes us very, very human. We're losing something that is going to help tether us to the ethics and the virtues that would make scientific progress beneficial. And actually now we're looking down the barrel of a gun, that if we don't get control of this thing, we're going to, it's going to be very, very bad for the world. And I think he was right. And so for him, it's pattern recognition, but it comes out of his understanding that if you aren't tethered via ethics or virtue to something bigger than yourself, something that transcends us, then we're going to run into a lot of issues. And it just takes a couple generations before that is lost. And so I think right now we're kind of hopefully in this sort of reawakening where people are realizing the limitations of this model and starting to return, but it's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of hard work and intentionality.
Yeah, and I think that's right on. You bring up this distinction between his pre-modern mind versus the modern or postmodern mind that we're interacting with today. And this is a distinction that I make a lot of times in my classes, that in the pre-modern world, whether we're talking about the pagans of the classical era, your Aristotle, your Plato, whoever, or we're talking about the medieval philosophers and theologians, they all have this idea that the reality is what it is. It existed before us, exists beyond us, and that there is a narrative playing out here. Plato would talk about how, all things begin with the good and rightly oriented are going to move back in that direction. You get something very similar adapted by the likes of Augustine, adapted by the medievals. All good things come from God, all good things are meant to return back to God. And so there is this story of reality, and the path of virtue is in finding our place within that story, playing the role
Yes.
that we are meant to fulfill. Whereas once you move into the modern era, in conjunction with the scientific revolution, we start to get some shifts in orientation, where you get philosophers like even Rene Descartes, the father of modernity. The one hand, he's looking for objective truth, but in a way that places himself, his own subjectivity, at the very center of the
Yeah.
quest of knowledge. And so it's not far removed from, you know, the most foundational truth I have is my own existence, to all I can know is my own existence. That modern to postmodern move is not a very big step. Um,
Right.
and then when you bring in the scientific revolution, which came along with modernity, and now we have nothing has a purpose, a telos. Everything is just whatever I decide to do with it. And so our scientific knowledge is not about better understanding this world in which we are nested, that's directed toward a common goal. Nature is no longer our sibling. Now it's just
Right.
a thing we can do stuff with.
Yes.
And then that turns itself onto our own bodies and all that entails in the modern world. And so yeah, I think you're exactly right that Lewis had a much better understanding of what a thing is and what a thing is for, namely human nature. um, which is why he says that education without values is, and that's what we try to do, right? We want to have a neutral education, supposedly, but he said education without values just makes a man a more clever devil. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
um, that education is meant to be for the formation of the person. Um,
Absolutely. I
so
like I
yeah, go
like
ahead.
that the distinction between the pre-modern and the modern. It's there was this like we were talking about with the medieval cathedral. There's this cohesion that's focused on divine harmony and resonance. I mean, Lewis talked about he used musical terms all the time. Like he used the arguments of transposition, right? So, and this is very Platonic in that you have let's just take a Beethoven symphony as an example. You have the fullness of a thing, but you can't play that on your own. And so we transpose it to a piano, but and it's a reflection of the real. It's a reflection of the totality, but it is just that. It's just what we can put human words to. So there's something that goes beyond what we can really argue with our mouth or with our brains. And so we're doing our best at creating this resonance with who we're supposed to be, the ought to kind of the way things ought to be and will be too, that hope that he always presents. And then the modern mind sees it more as a domination or power. And once again, that comes straight out of that postmodern jump, like you're talking about, where the only true moral decision is based off of who is excuse me, is in power at the time. And that just leads to all sorts of problems on its face. The arguments fall apart within the presentation of them. You don't really have to rebut them because you can't make a value claim at all, and yet they are making a value claim about what they're saying. And so, yeah, I think we're living in the fruits of that sort of jump, and it's a weird time.
So like, obviously this modern position, this postmodern position of there are no transcendental values. Yet here's how we ought to put together society, and here's how you ought to live. Like it's obviously irrational at the core, and that's something that Lewis is demonstrating. And so recognizing that, like, how do we rationally engage with that,
Mm.
recognizing we're not actually dealing with reason? Like, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh goodness. Um, that's a great question, and that's I think the biggest hurdle we have because you're dealing with two competing worldviews that share nothing really. Um, they can't both be true, and you have a society. And I don't want to put everything on the systems, though it is there. The systems are there, and they're doing what they do. The principalities are doing what they do. Um, but you have entire generations now that view the highest good for their life is that momentary happiness. Like that's the mark by which they judge if they've lived a good life, is if they were happy more times than they weren't. And happiness is fleeting, and happiness can be selfish, and it's not bad to be happy. But I think if I had my choice between happiness and joy, we would argue that joy, and I think joy is a virtue you have to cultivate. It's a gift from God, and it's also something you have to work towards, really understanding. And so part of it, it's like the arguments don't work for most of these people. And so what I would say is there's something about story that does a better job of presenting that truth than the arguments, right? Like, let me just give a quick example. So we watched our nephews this weekend, and I bought them a little. They're 7, 5, and 2, and they do everything together. So I can't just like pull out the full Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and read. The 2-year-old would be like running through walls, right? But I got this really short illustrated version of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I'm reading it to them, and it gets to the point where Aslan's introduced, and Asher, the 5-year-old, says, "Just like Jesus," you know, and I'm like, "Wow, you don't realize how profound that is," because for him, I could have sat down and told him, um, the story of Jesus, and he's heard it. He goes to church, and we've shared those things with him, but he saw it in story, and it clicked for him, you know. And so I think in a lot of ways that I think what's so pernicious about this new worldview, this postmodern worldview, is it's also taken over Hollywood, it's taken over books, it's taken over everything. And so people aren't engaging with good stories. I mean, you had something like the Lord of the Rings films that came out 20 plus years ago that spoke to the entire world. Why is that? Because it was so, and they're not perfect adaptations. Nothing can be, but I think they were good adaptations, and they did a good job of at least showing this, the virtue, self-sacrifice, heroism, all these sorts of things that in the modern world we kind of scoff at as kind of old fashioned, or I don't know, kind of pretentious, whatever it is. Like, oh, just the old guys are talking about heroism. Like they don't understand what it's like to be Gen Z or millennials. And so I think part of what's been so tough and why we've lost so many cultural battles is because people aren't engaging with good stories. So if to answer your question, I think the arguments are important more so for me, for us, as we are already on the side that's trying to cultivate that virtue and those values in us. I think for the people that are outside, that are immersed in that postmodern worldview where nothing matters, the nihilism that, nothing really matters, people don't matter. We're just, parasites on the planet. We're cancer, whatever they say. I think it's going to be engaging with good stories, fictional and non-fictional, like stories of heroism, um, stories that kind of you have to breathe in and breathe out to get. It's not just consumption. It's not just media to be consumed. It's something to live with and let kind of permeate your being. Tolkien's like that. It's like it's a Christian story. I don't get the arguments online that it's like obviously a pre-Christian world, but it's a very Christian story. And but someone coming to that for just an adventure story might struggle. Be like, oh, what's all this he's doing here in these books. But when you come there and you begin to live with it and sit with it, you begin to be changed by it. And so I think that's going to be the major systemic change that has to happen is we have to take back story. And yeah, I think guys like Lewis and Tolkien are a great place to start.
Yeah, again, I think that's well said. When I teach my philosophy classes at the state university, we'll do the main, I guess maybe not mainstream. A lot of people aren't even making students read the classics anymore. But I'll have them read traditional philosophy texts, but I also throw something in there, like I'll have them read Beowulf,
Yeah.
because you read Beowulf, and very few people, even our postmodern culture, are going to look at Beowulf and Grendel and say that they're on equal moral footing, and that's all subjective. Who's the hero here? I don't know.
Right.
It's all, no, it's like everyone recognizes the heroism of Beowulf, and he's a hero precisely because he stands for integrity and honor. He puts the world into order. He holds his own life rather cheaply in light of a surpassing value that he is trying to attain. Like he is a hero in a sense that anybody, like almost anybody, almost any postmodern who would elsewhere say, all morality and truth is subjective. They're going to read the story, like they know who the hero is, they know who they ought to
Hmm.
admire, and that's because, I mean, the reality of virtue. I mean, the if you get to the Latin roots, it basically means like manness, like the way that a person is supposed to be. It's tied into our human nature, and you can only reject that at the level of the superficial, at the level of the propaganda. But the reality always reasserts itself. Just like I'll ask my students, where at the beginning of the semester they'll tell me that everything's just made up, everything's a social construct, and I'll say, okay, who sees a moral difference between serving in a soup kitchen and committing genocide? It's like, okay, maybe you have to go to the extreme examples,
Right.
but if there's any place where people are willing to say one thing's good and another thing's bad, the follow-up is what makes good things good? Right? That's what Plato asks. That's the
Hmm.
Euthyphro dialogue. And that just is such an easy way of helping people to recognize they don't really believe the things that they say that they believe. They don't live as if they believe the things that they say that they believe. You
Right.
can't fight for justice or equality or, whatever ideal people might put up there unless you believe in ideals. And so I agree with you. I think that stories have such a important role in just helping people to see themselves in a way that they're not going to willingly see themselves in their postmodern context. Um, so I don't know. I mean, where do you want to go from here?
Well, I can add to that. I think you're 100% correct. Um, the issue that you run into is, I think, one of the primary, maybe the primary, um, fundamental, what's the word I'm looking for? What makes this postmodern thing? It's the stuff that makes it up, right? It's cognitive dissonance is essentially what I'm trying to say. Because you have people, you can point that out to them. Like I've seen this argument online many times about, um, someone will come up and start trying to debate somebody who's arguing for objectivity. And they'll say, well, what about slavery? Was slavery bad? And I'm like, well, yeah, of course. And they're like, but there was a time when the majority of the world, if you asked the majority, they'd say, no, slavery's fine. And for some reason, they always sidestep this. People go a long, they'll do a lot to keep their worldview intact, even ignoring things that are flat out ridiculous on their face, like what you said. You may have had a different experience if you're teaching philosophy students, because they're probably trained in philosophy, you know, and there's something there that if you're doing that, if you're kind of immersing yourself in that sort of mode, then you can probably see the logical errors. But there are a lot of people in the modern world that can be presented with that logical error and still just kind of clamp down around the lie. And so I don't know how you begin to win that ground back, um, as a culture, without doing it person to person. Like, we need more people that are out there, like what you're doing. Obviously, you have a class, but it's very different than, just putting out a book that no one's going to read, or talking into the void. It's like there's something that happens when you engage with someone personally, and you kind of getting wrapped up in each other's stories, that I think can maybe start to break down those walls. But it's a very challenging thing when you present that. Well, because the reality is, and this is one of those little kitschy, pithy statements that I heard growing up in the evangelical church, that is so true, and now it feels like a stereotype, so people kind of brush it off. If you're saying there is no absolute truth, then that is the one absolute truth, right? You always have to make an exception for one, right? Because if and just like what you said, if you show one difference between, um, telling a white lie to your parents and committing genocide, if there's one differentiator there, then they can be everywhere. And now you have to start making these value claims. And how do you do that in a secular, post Christian world, when people are completely fine with living in that cognitive dissonant space? It's very, very challenging.
Yeah, and this is when I think that Socrates really becomes helpful in that, you look at the way that he argues with people, he doesn't really say a very lot in the Platonic dialogues. He asks clarifying questions. Now, obviously, he has points in the way that he's doing that, but he what he really does is he, at least rhetorically, express an interest in the person he's talking to, gets them to just give an account for the things that they believe.
Mm,
And, eventually, if you get down to the roots and you recognize, well, there actually are no roots, that then creates the right kind of vulnerability to have, I think, a more productive conversation. Not always. I mean, sometimes, I mean, even those dialogues, a lot of times you get to the end point where the supposed expert recognizes they don't know what they're talking about and they'll just, run away or, just
yeah,
ignore the
or
problem.
insult
But
or yeah.
right. But I do think that that Socratic method is very useful in that you're not necessarily actively arguing. There is objective truth. There might be a place for that. But just in asking questions and
Mm,
helping your conversation partner themselves to better understand their own position or lack thereof, I think does a good job of helping people get kind of disenchanted with postmodernism. At least that's
yeah,
been my experience. Recognize that there's not really anything there and that it doesn't account for the way that they live their lives, which then asks the question, well, what could account for the way that I'm living my life? Um, it's kind of similar to what we've been talking about with morality. I mean, even like the issue of beauty, that my students will usually tell me that beauty is entirely a social construct or it's all subjective, it's in the eye of the beholder, something of that nature. But then I'll have them go to the local art museum and do just a short little assignment, very easy academically, but tell me one piece of art that stands out to you as being particularly compelling and tell me why. And then do the same thing with something that you find kind of off-putting and tell me why.
mhm,
And the vast majority are going to pick, some kind of like Renaissance painting or, some classical image from an older time when we're trying to deal with actual reality. And just about all
mhm.
of them discount modern art, which is quite intentionally nonsense, right? It's
Right,
intentionally meant to deconstruct our understanding of reality. And so these classical images just stand out to them because they're beautiful. And like
right,
we know that. Like you have to program yourself to reject the reality of beauty, just as you have to program yourself to reject the idea of morality. But even that can never go all the way down to your soul because so it brings back to what made Lewis so astute. Like we have a nature, we have an essence, we have a purpose, and we know that if we're honest with ourselves.
right. I like what you just said. You have to program yourself to deny these things, to deny these realities. I think. I mean, you see it in Lewis. I don't know. Have you seen this book before?
Yeah, I've not read it. Amazon recommends it to me all the time, but I've not read it.
It's great. Um, it was only released in 2022, but it's really, really good. You know, like you said, you can program yourself, and that's that cognitive dissonance maybe I'm talking about. Because at the deepest levels, the people that are saying there's no value to truth claims are still making truth claims. Um, they may be disordered, they may be bent, to use a ransom trilogy term, but they're still like aiming for that in some way. They're still aiming for resonance or harmony, um, but they are doing a poor job because once again they've had to take what was natural here and twist it to fit it in there. I think that book covers a lot of these things we're talking about. I think you'd really enjoy it. But what I was going to say, I had something I wanted to pull up. But yeah, so yeah, this was the quote, the exact quote from the book, that I think speaks to this. This then is what is at stake when considering Lewis's admiration for medieval cosmology, because for him the medieval universe was not just a system of exploded scientific beliefs, but the natural icon of transposition, the greatest example of the spiritual world expressing itself in the limited vocabulary of the physical natural world. And one of those ways that we are transposing those things is through art and through the beauty of art. And so you look at the decay, like you were talking about the modern art and how it's intentionally meant to subvert our expectations or our desire for beauty. and they call it good, or there's that hubris involved. This is a good thing. We see that in culture right now. We're subverting everything to be true about heroism, and that's a good thing. Here's why: it gets you to. It's the Star Wars model. I still get mad about that. I mean, we should talk about Star Wars for a second, but yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. It's the Socratic method, getting people to recognize, because if you're preaching to them, they might be more closed off. If you get them to reveal it to themselves, eventually they get down to the bottom and they're like, what is this? Where did it come from? Um, Jordan Peterson talked about the fact that everyone that calls themselves nihilists aren't really nihilists. And I think that's true. It's like you may say you are, but the way you live your life, the way you order your days, the way you order your relationships, most people aren't nihilists. So there's that disconnect between the brain and the soul, um, in the people that would claim that, because they still, like we said, are making those truth claims often and over and over and over. When they decide to brush their teeth rather than not, when they decide to call their mother rather than not, things like that.
Yeah, and as Plato says, everyone by nature seeks the good.
Hmm.
Now, the problem is that we fall short and we value the lesser goods over the ultimate. We don't recognize the good that is behind good things. But as you said, anything we do, you brush your teeth, whatever, like even if God forbid you like decide to kill yourself, like you do that in the grossest nihilistic act because you believe that's better than an alternative.
Right.
And so, even if you are moving in a profoundly negative direction, you still do it because you believe that's better than a different move. And at that point, you're still dealing with different paths of meaning, of even fixed meaning, at least from the way that you're looking at it. And so, nihilism really is it's an impossible position to be in
Hmm.
because you're always making choices. Um, Now, you mentioned Star Wars. I know we're kind of just meandering all around. That's fine. It's all related. Um, we just started a Star Wars series over here, and so I mean, I don't know what analysis do you have to bring here now that you brought it up?
Well, I will say that I'm watching Andor, and I'm actually kind of mad that I like it because I've been so mad at what most of Disney has done. There I still have issues. It does kind of what it did with The Last Jedi at times, where it conflates the what you would argue is the good guys and the bad guys, and you see, there's that still going on. And I get people want that now. They want nuanced characters, and but I think there's a way to have nuanced characters without making them morally gray. Um, it's more challenging. It takes a little bit more intention, but um, I think of the one that always comes back to me is The Last Jedi. When you have this this idea, and it really, I didn't like the movie at all, really, from the beginning when he threw the lightsaber over his shoulder. And I was like, oh, so this is what it's going to be. This is what's happening to my beloved Star Wars. But really, when you had the I think Canto Bight, was that the planet that they were on with the it was like the Vegas planet, and then they escape with the Guillermo del Toro character. I think Urbanicio del Toro, is that his name? And he gives them that long exposition about how the rebellion and the empire are the same. They buy their weapons from the same people. It's like, okay, I know you're making a claim about the world, and it's probably pretty true. Like, at the end of the day, human governance and governments are they lean towards corruption. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we have to take the scripture seriously about principalities, and how it's very, very hard, very, very hard. That's why I'm kind of skeptical of the idea of Christian nationalism. I don't know. We don't have to get there, but there is something to be said when you are given governmental power, that it, kind of like the One Ring, it'll corrupt you, even if you feel like you are the one that has the strength to wield it properly. And so I get that they were trying to make it applied to the real world in some way. But at the end of the day, it just came across as preachy. And we're also not there on Star Wars to explore, the real world. We're there to get a story of good and evil and of light overcoming darkness. And I think it's really interesting in the old trilogy, there was no real talk of like the light side of the force. It was the dark side was the distortion of the way things really were. And so that's kind of tying back into the Lewis thing. Look at what we did. It's like rather than harmoniance and resonance with the way things ought to be or the way things are, you have a distortion. And then you have now in modern Star Wars is very much this kind of this dichotomy where they're trying to find balance in between. I just think that there's something dangerous about that and also something less interesting about that than the original trilogy, where you understood there's the force and then there's the distortion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think what made the original trilogy so great is that it is a archetypal fairy tale, and so we're dealing with the reality of good and evil. And as you said, that in the original trilogy, there's not this dichotomy between the light side and the dark side. There's the force and the dark side, that distortion. I think that starts to get a little bit blurred in the prequels, not quite so clear. But there's still a pretty clear division between the good guys and the bad guys. And so,
Right.
I kind of give the prequels a pass. We're moving away from the original, but I still think there's some value to be had there. But by the time we get to the sequel trilogy, when we have, Ghost Yoda destroying the old Jedi temple and Jedi sacred texts, and, now we're just gonna follow whatever intuition entirely,
Right.
that there is this more of a yin and yang understanding of the force. We're a lot more Manichaean here of
Mhm.
good and evil and perfect balance. It's just we lose track of what made Star Wars so great in that it is this clear line. I mean, you have ambiguity still. I mean, and even Tolkien talks about this, that a lot of times he's criticized for being too black and white in his morality, just because he believes morality is black and white.
Right.
They're separate things. Um, in one of his letters, Tolkien says that, on both sides of the war, on World War One in particular, on both sides of the war, um, he that you have men and you have orcs, you have demons and you have angels. Not to
Mhm.
say that there's no difference between the Axis and the Allies, but at the same time, like, people are people, and you could tell a story about the corruption of the Allies, but that's not a fairy story. A
Mhm.
fairy story helps us to recognize that, yes, some people may walk that line between good and evil, but good and evil themselves always have a line.
Right.
And so you can have an apparently morally ambiguous character. I mean, and Tolkien has these. Boromir, for example, right? Like, he is a hero, but
Mhm.
also he obviously has a villainous tendency to him, or even Denethor. That he
Mhm.
could. There's ways of looking at him as something of an ambiguous kind of figure, but morality is not ambiguous.
Right.
And I think
Right.
that's what makes Tolkien so compelling. And even in the Jackson adaptations, which, they changed a good bit, but I think that they maintain that basic reality of
Mhm.
the reality of good and evil. And I think that's one reason why that has spoken to so many people, why those movies are still relevant, now in 2025, across the globe, because they speak to deep human realities, that even postmodern people are deeply hungry for, which just makes me wonder, like, aside from an agenda, like, why why is Hollywood keep producing these stories that no one's going to talk about a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when obviously it's much more effective, even just on a marketing angle, to tell good stories about good and evil that people want, people buy, people talk about for years to come. But they don't do that because I guess they just don't want to.
Yeah. Well, I think, I have one point I want to make about the prequels. But let me address this first. At some point you start to wonder because they keep losing money on these kind of movies. It's like, will they ever run out of money? Well, who knows? It's all tax write-offs for them. They make one Top Gun Maverick and they cover their losses for 2 or 3 years. You know what I'm saying? It's and Top Gun Maverick is just an example because it was one bright spot amongst a year of ridiculous. I mean, it was also just a fun caper, but you know what I'm saying. It was very clear. Like you had your heroes, you had your um. But I think they view themselves as the people that are saving the world. I think they honestly view themselves as heroes, and they're very cemented in their belief that, once again, this ironic idea that they are the virtuous ones and that it's their job. They recognize the power of storytelling or propaganda. I'm going to call it propaganda. Um, and so for them, it's like, I don't care if this loses money, if this just changes one mind, right? So for them, because good and evil don't exist in the same way we'd understand, all that's left is the narrative. And I don't mean like the narrative of a story. I mean, it is a narrative of a story, but um, the anti-narrative of reality, right? Which is what they're trying to push. Um, and so I think honestly, the reason we keep getting it is because we have activists that have taken these jobs rather than creative people that are in tune with that resonance, and you get those examples every once in a while. We're like, okay, that was a really good story. And I always want to have a conversation with those people that wrote it to try and figure out what is their worldview. Are they double agents? Do they view themselves as kind of moving through the shadows doing work? Or did they just kind of strike gold once every 10 times? I don't know. It's complicated, but that comes back to the idea that we just need to have we I think people on, to use the term, our side, the people that are kind of engaging with these things as they are, we need to do a better job of creating culture, of creating art, of creating books and movies and things that speak to the truth of the world, rather than walks the fine line and tries to be subversive and just for the sake of being subversive and deconstructing. What I wanted to say about the prequels, and just really diving back in real quick, even in the prequels, and I give them a pass too. I went and saw the Revenge of the Sith in the theaters for the 20th anniversary, and in a lot of ways, it's it's not a good movie. I mean, I love it. I love it, and that's what's so funny. I love it, and I'm also like, some of this is kind of, or it. The setting was interesting. The execution wasn't always interesting, I guess is probably what I want to say. But I have a nostalgic flair for it. But you see, even in the prequels, what it meant to bring balance to the Force, even Obi-Wan says this to Anakin, was to destroy the Sith, not join them. So there's this idea that the dark side, and this is kind of, this ties back into Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. It's not balance in that, oh, we have to balance the good and evil. It's that, oh, the evil has gotten out of balance. The evil has become too powerful. The way you bring balance is not by holding both and becoming gray. It's by diminishing the power of the evil and elevating the power of the resonance, the Force. And I think it's so funny that they took the idea that Palpatine presented and have made that the basis on which they've made new Star Wars, because it was the one that was living in the distortion that really brought about that sort of dichotomy. Oh, you have the light side and the dark side. It was a deception rather than pointing to the reality. And so, but they took that speech from Palpatine about Darth Plagueis, right? And now that became, the balance was no longer a destruction of the dark and an elevation of the harmonious, I guess. It actually became a dichotomy, right? And I think it's really interesting that they took that from the deceptive one in the story and made that the basis of the story moving forward. That balance is actually becoming a gray Jedi.
So Disney is his real Padawan all along.
Yeah, exactly, dude. Yes, Disney was Palpatine's Padawan all along. I love that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I do think it's a good point, and that is one reason why when I first saw the prequels, everyone hated on them for a good while until the nostalgia started to redeem them a little bit. But in my recent rewatch, I enjoyed them. Like, I mean, yeah, we can see the problems there, but um, they do maintain a certain continuity, even if it's in degraded form, a certain continuity with what made the original trilogy so great. Um,
100%.
But yeah, I mean, moving on, I don't even know really what Star Wars is anymore. The problem is Star Wars doesn't know what Star Wars is. I mean, you
Yeah.
look at the sequel trilogy, and I mean, you got changing directors with different visions, and there's no continuity anymore. And I feel like in the original trilogy, we're telling this archetypal, really existential personal tale. The prequels take that and kind of adapt it to more of a political kind of scale. But then once we get to the Disney era, it's like they're just doing stuff. And I guess that goes along with the fragmented postmodern worldview of there's
Yeah.
no united idea behind anything. So we're just doing stuff.
Right.
And I, I'm Star Wars is always going to have its fan base, no matter where they go. It's established that kind of credentials. But at the same time, like I'm not convinced that this is what people want.
Right. And I think you're right. I mean, the viewership will prove that. You have a pretty good show in Andor that was the least popular release that Disney did at the time. I think it's kind of renewed now, like a new interest with season two, because it's actually really, really interesting TV. But yeah, I mean, even going back to the sequel trilogy, Force Awakens, I was okay with. Like I was like, okay, there's a couple things here that I'm like, it didn't feel earned. It didn't feel these sort of things. I didn't like what they did to Han Solo. Though I feel as if they had landed Kylo Ren's story, you maybe could have made it make sense. But it's in the light of the next two movies that I got more angry about the death of Han Solo. And I saw what they were doing. It wasn't a tool for the story. It was a way to push their idea that we should kill the past, right? Which is, I mean, I think even Kylo Ren says that a couple times, like, or someone says that, and Yoda says that. Good grief, when he's burning the Jedi Temple, he doesn't say that exact thing, but that's what they're saying. That's the value they're proposing, is that all that old stuff doesn't matter. What the truth is really in here, right? You can find it if you look deep in here, right? And so, and even down to Rise of Skywalker, somehow Palpatine returned. In the expanded universe in the Dark Empire comic books, I mean, somehow Palpatine returned, but it felt earned in those, even though they're not great comics, but they still tried. It wasn't just salvaging a trilogy where no one knew what was happening, and no one knew what was going on. It was part of the story, and it was part of Luke's journey in the expanded universe. He actually goes and turns to the dark side for a little while. He's playing a double agent. He's trying to learn from Palpatine to see what made him so powerful. And then he takes that back to his new students and says, we're not going to do this. This is how you avoid this trap, right? It was actually education. It was a cultivation of some sort of virtue, a way to sidestep the trappings that so many had fallen into before. And so I think that you just have in Disney the Padawan of Palpatine. I love that. I'm going to start using that.
Yeah, I mean, going to the Force Awakens, one of the things that first really upset me, especially in my recent rewatch, this is my first time watching it since the theaters. I just have not been inclined to return to this era. Um, that when I kind of like the character of Finn, or at least the potential that he had. I
Yeah.
think he could have been an interesting character if they did better with him. But when he first really comes onto the stage and starts interacting with Rey, he's a very kind of chivalric kind of attitude, right? He's trying to serve her, trying to protect her, trying to
Mm-hmm.
play that kind of knightly sort of role toward her. And then she doesn't really resist that directly. The problem is she scoffs at him, trying to
Yes.
protect her. Trying to serve her, trying to play that sort of role, and that was one of the early signs to me of what Disney was doing here. That
Mm-hmm.
we're not even outright rejecting; we're dismissing as absurd or juvenile traditional values, even like the traditional relationships between the male hero and the his feminine counterpart.
Right.
And that right there just alerts us to the fact that we're engaging in deconstruction here. Like that's what this is all about. And then Last Jedi just takes that to the most clear level when we get the, Ghost Yoda of all people,
Yeah.
destroying the Jedi traditions.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
and all of the character arcs that we get in the original trilogy are just massacred. I mean, with Han Solo being just this deadbeat divorcee dad who
Yeah.
has no relationship with his family, to Luke Skywalker drinking milk from a space cow in isolation. Like, everything's just so degraded that they essentially did what Kylo Ren did, right? They killed their
Mhm.
father, and that's exactly what the series is. Um, that being
Have
said, I
you read
mean,
much of the expanded universe, the
no,
EU?
actually, I have not read any of it yet.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Han Solo because Han Solo becomes so heroic. You know, him and Leia get married. They have twins, Jason and Jaina. They have, and they have Anakin. Um, was Anakin, no, Anakin was no, yeah, it was Anakin Solo. Um, and you have this continuing story of that saga, and he's a great father, and he's a also a war hero, and it's such a dichotomy for someone who grew up reading the EU to see what happened to him, and it made a ton of sense when you start bringing in the sort of subversive deconstruction sort of things, why they had to make him that way. Because every person in every male, I'm just going to say, every male hero in these stories, they had to make look pathetic, and they had to be saved or redeemed by the Ray character, or even in the Obi-Wan series, they made Obi-Wan a bumbling idiot, and he's redeemed in that sense and saved over and over again by an 8-year-old Leia, you know. And you're just watching, he's like, one of the most ridiculous moments was they're at this like gate. Did you watch the show
Yeah, when
Obi-Wan?
it came out, but I don't remember it very clearly. So
So they're on a desert planet, and there's this laser gate, right? And they could literally walk around it to keep going because they were on foot. They could literally walk around it. He's like, "What do we do, huh?" And she takes a blaster and like shoots it, and it shuts off. I'm like, what? The only point of that was to make him look stupid, and it was just deeply offensive. And we have to ask ourselves. I find myself wondering, why do I care so much about these characters that I get so angry when they take a dump all over them? You know, like why does it bother me so much? They're just made up characters. But kind of going back into our original conversation, they're actually they're actually not, like, that they're fictional, but they also speak to something that we want to be, that we can aspire to or try to emulate. They it A good heroic story resonates with what we know to be true about the universe, with what we want to be true about ourselves, the way we ought to be. C.S. Lewis always talked about the ought tos, right? And when you see that happen, it's like watching a friend get betrayed, you know. And so I think that's why when people are like, "Why do you care so much? Just don't watch it." It's like, no, no. These are my friends. These are people that matter to me, even though they're fictional, because I see in them what I hope to become or what I hope to be in my own life. Um, so yeah, it's a very weird thing. They did the same thing with one of my other favorite fantasy series called The Wheel of Time, um, on Amazon Prime. There's a moment at the end of the first book that cements a main character's role, and they took it away from him in the series and gave it to, let's just say, more marginalized communities, you know. And and it's like I'm watching this, and I don't understand. You have a built-in fan base of millions of people. These are some of the best-selling books of all time, and they're best-selling because people love the characters. And then you come in and you do something upside down, and it will push away these people. And then now you no longer have that millions of person fan base built in anymore. You're now having to scramble, and they just keep doing it over and over. And I think it's just a sign of that brokenness that we're talking about, and this sort of idea that they're trying to use power, institutional power, to warp, the natural inclinations of people to aim for that good. They're hoping that if they just bang it down your throat enough, if they just hit you in the head over and over enough, that eventually you just be like, okay, whatever. Yes, heroes don't exist. There's no such thing as good and evil. But what they're actually doing, I think, is they're creating radicalized traditionalists. And I think we're kind of starting to see that. You're seeing a huge reaction, and it's getting more and more violence, not the right word, because no one's killing each other over it, but more and more passionate with every time they destroy a story. You're getting more and more people that are saying, like, this is ridiculous. I want my heroes back. And so, to go back to that original thing we were talking about, how do we change this? Well, part of it is they're going to keep doing this because that's what they want to do. They're nice. They are NICE. They are trying to anti humanize everything. And you're going to have a building resistance that's going to come back and say, no, you're not going to do that to our stories. And I think eventually people will get angry enough that we'll have sort of a parallel artistic economy where you have Hollywood and then you have something else that is, you're starting to see that with, I think, things like the Rabbit Room. And there are these people that are starting to push back and create good art again. But it's going to be a matter of, it's a slow process because the institutional power is on the side of Hollywood. And now we have to kind of build something on the other side. And hopefully eventually those converge again into good storytelling.
Yeah, and of course the danger here is that the reaction can become, well, reactionary. It can
Yeah.
become political where, yeah, we don't like this, so-called progressivism, the secular movement into nothingness. And so we're just going to, reassert ourselves. This is where you get the militant right, which I think
Yes.
can be a dangerous move, that's
Oh, yeah.
in the direction of our side, but sort of missing what made the good things of tradition good.
Right.
And so it's important that we maintain, the virtue of the pre-modern era that Lewis appreciated so much, that we maintain this assertion of reality and not just the assertion of our side. Um,
Hmm.
it's like when when Joshua's preparing for the Battle of Jericho, right? The angel of the Lord shows up and he says, "Are you on our side or their side?" The response he gets is no. that's, that's not the right question. The question is, what side are you on, right? Not, you
Yes.
know, um,
Yeah.
yeah,
You risk with that reaction, obviously the militant right sort of idea. Me and my wife were talking about that recently. I'm like, you're radicalizing a lot of young people and you don't realize it. And there are people that feel hopeless and despair, and those can become dangerous people. But also on the artistic side, you risk just making propaganda of your own. And I think that's where the storytelling tied in with virtue, with trying to access this medieval understanding, the more and more people are trying to do that through people like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And the more and more people use that to inspire their stories, you're getting stories. You're not getting propaganda. And that's the challenge, is fighting fire with fire. And I think if we have anything to learn from, good grief, any of our greatest stories, you know, um, fighting fire with fire, Boromir, with oh, we can use this one ring to fight the evil one. Why we have this powerful weapon? Why don't we use it? Um, that's always going to corrupt you at the end of the day. And so I think that getting away from the idea that we have to respond with our own violence or our own propaganda, we have to stay true to that harmonic resonance with with the narratives and the storytelling that we know have built the scaffolding of minds like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and really try to access those. I think that's where the power of storytelling comes into play. Joseph Campbell talks about it. Jung talks about it. And I think that we have to make sure that that becomes the core or that's the heart of what we're doing, and not revenge, if that makes any sense.
right. It's we don't follow Vader because he's our father. It's about redeeming our father, right?
Mhm.
It's that we want to recover what is good within our fathers, within tradition, and that's what we want to recover. Which Star Wars pinging back there. I mean, it's the idea of redeeming our father versus simply killing our father, right? That's the
Yes.
difference between the different trilogies. That's the difference between ultimately what is that we're talking about here. We want to recover what is good, not merely follow authority, whatever that means. Um,
Right.
well, good. Um, well, we hit on a lot of, I think, really important topics here. I mean, is there anything else that you wanted to mention in this conversation?
Man, I mean, I feel like we got off Lewis, but that's okay.
Yeah.
It was all tied into the same sort of things. I'd love to come back another time and talk more specifically till we have faces or that hideous strength. But yeah, today, man, I feel good. I feel good about that conversation.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like Lewis, maybe that's too broad. It's easy to go into everything adjacent to Lewis. And I think everything we
Yeah,
talked about is adjacent to what Lewis was doing. But yeah, so maybe next time we'll pick one particular book and go from there.
I'm
Uh,
down with that.
all right, Spencer. Well, thank you for joining us, and we will definitely do it again sometime.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you. All right. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. I certainly did. I look forward to having Spencer on again at some point in the future. In fact, I think he's going to join us for the next Star Wars chat coming up soon. But I do want to quickly remind you that we do have a couple Mythic Mind courses underway. We've got Hannah's Latin course just started. Josh's Paradise Lost course just started. And my course on A Brief History of Ideas begins the week of the 18th. That's coming up. It's not too late to enroll. You can either enroll in just that course, or if you become an annual Tier 3 patron of Mythic Mind, then you get access to all courses that begin in this term. And that's currently A Brief History of Ideas, Plato's Stoicism Until We Have Aces, The Elder Scrolls and Philosophy, and at the beginning of 2026, we have the Silmarillion. And so go ahead and enroll over on Patreon today. And before we go, I want to thank all current patrons. And by name, I want to thank all Tier 3 patrons and higher. So that's Mark, Amanda, Chase, Chaz, Clinton, David, Aaron, Evie, Jamie, Justin, Kyle, Paul, Roger, Tyler, and William. You all, as well as my Tier 1 and Tier 2 patrons, help me to keep going further up and further in. And so if you enjoy the show, whether you want to kind of take the plunge and become a Tier 3 annual patron to continue with this community through all these different studies, or you just want to throw $5 my way every month, any bit of support helps me to continue doing things like this, and it is all appreciated. And I would love to see you on the inside of this incredible community. But that's it for now. Until next time, Godspeed. When you go to the roots of the word philosophy, you find the love of wisdom, which unfortunately is not what you find at the roots of all who call themselves philosophers. Now, how do we get here? What are the ideas that shape our world, and what can the old world tell us in response to the perennial questions of what it means to be human, what is our purpose, and what, if anything, ought we aspire to? In A Brief History of Ideas, we will navigate major epics of thought and survey some of the most important figures in the Western canon, including Plato, Aristotle, Boethius, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, Descartes, Nietzsche, Sartre, and Kierkegaard. And of course, we will consider even more names, but these are the thinkers that will supply our primary readings. Each week will include primary sources that will be provided as PDFs, although these are all texts that do belong in your personal library. You'll be recommended some secondary texts, you'll be provided with some recorded presentations for you to watch at your leisure, ongoing Discord chats, and weekly live meetings to discuss the readings. I've been teaching philosophy for many years, and I can say with confidence that you will leave this 6-week course with a better understanding of the foundations of Western thought than most contemporary philosophy majors. Enroll today by going to patreon.com/mythicmind and checking out the shop, or you can gain access to all courses that begin during the term of your subscription by purchasing a Tier 3 annual subscription. So again, purchase a Tier 3 annual subscription, and I will give you a special code that gives you access to all courses that start in this term. And I sincerely hope to see you there.